What's going on, guys? Two things are going to happen in this video. One, my battery is going to get relocated from the engine bay into the trunk about right here, and I've got the cables and everything to do that. The second thing that's going to happen is my ABS is going to get moved from where it's at to where the battery is. That way, when I put the big turbo on the 2JZ GTE VVTi head that's going on the IS300 factory block with forged internals and all of that stuff, the turbo won't be in the way of the ABS, or the ABS won't be in the way of the turbo, however you want to look at it. Also check the progress bar for this video because you'll be able to jump throughout different parts of this video. If you only want to watch the part about the ABS relocation, then you can watch that, or if you only want to watch the part about the battery, then you can jump throughout different sections of the battery or go back and watch something again. So the parts that I have for the battery are, this is a mega fuse, and it's basically a 300 amp fuse that's made for automotive up to 32 volts DC. And this is a shutoff switch, but I've drilled out this rivet, so it's not a shutoff switch anymore. Eventually, this fuse is going to basically just like sit inside of there, and I'm going to drill a hole in it so that I can bolt the fuse in. This came in a 5-pack. It was like 15 bucks. It's called a mega fuse, and they're pretty massive. This body of it is about an inch, probably a little over an inch. And this is a little less than an inch, so this has to be cut some. I'm not going to cut this. And then I'll have a 300 amp fuse so that when these battery cables are in the trunk, this one I kind of went overkill. This one is 2 gauge, I believe, and this is 0 gauge. So I had this one made. It's a place on the eBay that makes cables. It's solid copper. These are the cables that are going to go to the trunk. I know that you can ground your battery to the chassis, but I am not going to do that because the battery is actually made to clean up the voltage coming off the alternator, and I want a solid copper connection coming off of the battery on both the positive and the negative terminals. I don't want to bolt it to the chassis. I'll spend the 70 bucks that it costs for this ground wire to not bolt it to the chassis, just because I want the battery to do its job in cleaning up the voltage with a solid copper connection, vice steel connection going from like the back of the car to the front of the car, which will work, but that's not what I want to go for. The car wasn't made for a trunk mount battery. And then a friend of mine printed this box for me. This is just it's kind of like a mock-up to see if it would hold the weight of a battery, because this is PLA, I think. And I also have a junk battery, and I want to put some battery acid from the battery in this to see what happens to it, just to see if it will seal up a battery really well in the trunk, and if I have to worry about the battery acid getting on something and then eating through it, because I don't know. This is 3D printed. And then for relocating the brake module, I actually have all of these cables. So these came from Napa, and you could, if you don't have a Napa near you, then you can get it from another hardware store. But they have they're 3/16 lines, and I believe the ones on the IS300 are 3/16 lines, and they're the appropriate Japanese tapered brake line fitting that is required for Toyota. But I'll have the links of these all pop up in the description because they're all various lengths. So the battery needs to be relocated first for the ABS block to go where the battery is. And I do want to mention that I was very much on the fence of whether I wanted to change these brake lines out and still use the ABS, or just delete it altogether and then put in something like a Chase Bays system and have the adjustable proportioning valve instead of an ABS. So that way I don't have a brake booster. I can get the brake booster out of the way so it won't interfere with my big turbo manifold that's going to be going on, which I don't think it's going to bump the brake booster, but I don't know. Look at that, there's no battery, and my throttle body's humming like it's supposed to. That means there's a battery in the trunk. So I'm gonna show how I routed the wire. We'll come back here. So there is the fancy battery. It's actually just a normal battery. This car came with an Optima battery, which the Optima battery I have running my FJ Cruiser, and I'm going to put the Optima battery back into this once I finish rebuilding the engine with the forged internals and the GTE VVTi head, and all of that stuff is on the car, so the Optima battery will go back in. But with so this is the battery that's in here now, but it gives it a very, very strong start, and this is the same exact battery that I had in the engine bay, which means that now I have a better connection on the battery. So the way that I ran the wires, ground cable, they go straight from the battery and it's bolted into the bracket that goes onto the intake manifold for now. I have to free up a little bit of slack so that I can bolt it into the block like I want to. So that will be later. I just have to find some slack in this cable that I have, and I'll have the length of it pop up because I think it was 11 feet, but I don't remember exactly. So I'll have the length of this pop up. And this is just the BMW 328i cable, and I think it's 1 foot shorter than this one, or approximately a foot shorter than this one. You can see I have the battery tilted at an angle right now because I can't tuck it in the corner like I wanted to. And then I've got it anchored with this rubber strap for now, temporary until my friend finishes building the box and I can anchor the box. I have the fuse mounted. This is a 300 amp mega fuse. Had to drill holes in this. Actually, I had to drill holes just in this one and then enlarge the hole that was on this. And then I just clamped the fuse in. So I drilled this, I bolted this in straight through the fuse, and then I clamped this in, 10 millimeter bolt that it really, when it's tightened down, the fingers just grab the fuse a little bit more, so it's not gonna come out. It's stuck. I'll start the car in a second and show that this does actually work. And the BMW had this, I'm guessing that this went to a fuse box and it bolted in there because this was just out and open, and I tried to disconnect this, but I couldn't get a good enough grip on the wire as it was in the car. I should have disconnected it before I put all this stuff in the car. I'm gonna pop underneath the car and look at how it's run. So that's the cable there. I put it in this sheath. I still have to like zip tie it. There's the brake line here, so I'm gonna use the 2 brake lines that are, these 2 thin lines, this and this. So the power wire I have in this sheath just so I could see if it's scraping on anything. So that sheath that goes all the way up there, and it pokes out here. There's actually another one of these little rubber grommets that comes out like right under here. And at first I was using that one, but this cable is just a hair too short to where I can't get it to reach where I have it bolted straight onto the starter. So this cable goes up and it goes over there and it goes beside my clutch line and goes straight into the starter. I'll crawl under and get a better view in a second. But before I crawl under, I want to show how it goes from the trunk into the interior. I do have a back seat. I just took it out. Had to pull the amp out too. So power wire comes in this way. So you could see it goes, that the seat unbolts. There's 4 bolts. There's 1 here, 1 here, and then 1 over there and 1 over there. This bottom part of the seat, it's not even bolted in. It snaps in like most Toyota ones. So you can really just like grab underneath the front of it and yank it up. And it comes out of this little holder thing that it snaps into. And then this, you have to pry up so that you can get underneath the carpet and get to the little rubber plug that's like right about there where my finger's pointing. So I poked a hole in the middle of it with smooth edges so that it doesn't tear more, so that I could feed the power wire through. The wire that was there that was going down to the starter originally, that's still there. It's still coming up to this same spot. So this is still hot because that needs to go to the fuse box here, and eventually I'll probably run just a separate wire from this straight to the starter so that it'll split off of that, and it'll get power from that main unbroken wire that goes from the starter now to the trunk. And the ground wire, since it was a little longer, I actually just fed it all the way on the edge underneath the carpet, on the edge of this door jamb and then the edge of the driver's side door jamb, to go up into the same area where all the engine harness stuff feeds in through the firewall. So I just fed it up through there and then over, and then where I have it bolted in. So I'll show where it's bolted in a second. But these, there is a little gap, cables. There's a gap that's like right back here. If you look up underneath, I don't think I can get my camera to tilt up, but if you look up, you can see where I have these 2 cables going. They're going into the trunk there. And over here, so ground wire goes here, here, here. This is all from the previous videos. It's I'm not ready to tuck all the harness stuff away yet. I'm probably going to be putting engine management in this before I pull the engine out, so that I can tune it and get the Haltech running it, and I can get rid of the AEM piggyback that's on it, but just because that thing just has so many problems. Ground wire goes up and it feeds through the firewall, comes up here, and for now I have it bolted into this 10mm bolt hole that's in that bracket. This bracket bolts into the block and also the intake manifolds. I don't know if you can see it with all the hoses and stuff that's in the way, but it's right there where my hand is. starter sounds nice and strong. That's good. I want the starter to sound nice and strong because that means it has a solid connection. So now the battery's moved, I just have to do some final touch-up things, but I'll do that stuff later. Now I can focus on moving this ABS block from here to here, and then disconnecting the brake lines and then bending new ones to replace the old ones so that the new ones go over here. All right, so the game plan is remove all the lines first. We'll talk about that in a second. We'll talk about sizes and everything in a second, but remove all the lines first and then bend these lines to shape. Now, I do want to say a little word of caution. So there's brake fluid. Brake fluid is very corrosive to paint. Brake fluid will eat paint. It causes it to kind of bubble up and then you pretty much just brush off your paint and it's like this, it becomes goo. You don't want your paint to become goo. Even in the engine bay, it's painted, so wherever the paint disappears, you will have rust develop. So have a jug of water nearby, and everywhere that you get brake fluid, just brush it off. Just try to not get any of the water that you're using to wash off the brake fluid, try to not get it into the lines. It does take an hour or two for the brake fluid to soften up the paint, so you have a little bit of time. It doesn't immediately start eating the brake fluid like the alien blood in Aliens. You have a little bit of time, but I don't like it to even be on there for a few seconds. So I almost immediately wash it off with water. Just don't get it in the lines. You don't want water in your lines. I'm following a instructional that I found online that I was really looking for somebody with an instructional that had the line lengths to each one of the things. So I didn't have to measure everything. Going off of what they said, hopefully they measured everything properly. The instructional that I'm following, the guy used steel braided lines. So I'm going to mention his measurements that he used for each one of the locations, but I'm also going to use the hard line measurements that I have. And if any of these ended up being too long or too short, then I'm going to approximate about how much longer the hard line needs to be. And those sizes will be popping up as I talk about each one of the line locations and where it goes to. So that new size of what it should be will pop up if these lines are the wrong size. Following somebody else, I'm hoping he's right, but I'm also using steel solid lines where he had steel braided lines. So I got these lines at Napa, and really quickly, it's 130, 240s, this is all in inches. So 130 inch, 240 inches, 251 inches, and 160 inch. The 30 inch line goes here to the passenger brake, passenger front brake. 60 inch line goes to here to the driver side front brake. The two 40 inch lines, they go back here and then they curve down and they go down about a foot to where they go into a junction connector that's close to the starter. I'll try to include a picture and I'll have that pop up, but I'm definitely not going to get in there in video because I have trouble angling my gimbal up. Right now I can angle it down, that's how I'm doing this, but it's about a foot beneath here. So those are two 40 inch lines that go here, and each one of those goes into a junction block into a separate line that goes to the rear passenger and the rear driver. And then the other two brake lines that are left on the ABS block, they come over here. One goes to the front of the master cylinder and the other one goes here to the side of the master cylinder. The lines that I'm using are 51 inch lines. The lines that the guy used that ran steel braided lines, he used 48 inch lines. So he used 48 inch steel braided, I'm using 51 inch solid steel hard lines. And the last thing that remains is there's a little rubber line here that goes into, that actually goes over to the brake booster, I believe, but it's a rubber line back for a little ways and then it becomes kind of a hard line. I think it's this one, but it's like this plasticky line thing. This is really easy to cut and break. Make sure whatever you cut it with that you don't leave any fibers or any kind of like burrs inside. But this is, I think it's like a plastic coated aluminum thing, so it's yeah, it bends really easily. So it's really easy to bend up the way that you want it. If you wanted to straighten this out, this would probably flatten if you tried to bend it back straight. But for anyone else that wants to know, say if you wanted to do this a cheaper way and you're thinking like, well, why can't I use my factory hard lines, cut them, flare them, and then run them to the ABS block whenever it's relocated? So you can do that. But another word of caution, so with that, these brake lines, they're actually double flared. So they're flared out first and then they're flared back in. So you would need a double flare tool. You wouldn't just need a regular flare tool that you would use on, you know, like your home plumbing or something. Like these are flared twice. Brake lines, fuel lines, clutch lines. On a car, they're flared out and then it's curved around and flared back in. So you pretty much have to use the double flare. It's considerably better. Don't use the regular single flare tool. You'll have to pretty much spend money to get a double flare tool if you wanted to do that. That is an option. I've read about people doing that very thing. And that would probably make all of this easier because you could probably straighten out the lines where they go over here and cut it, put a different end on it, flare it out, and then use steel braided lines to go to the ABS block and hopefully not crush it whenever you bend it back straight. Because right now it's bent at a 90 and then you bend that 90 back straight. There's a good chance you're either going to weaken it or crush it. So if you weaken it, you're probably going to have a brake leak, fluid leak later on there, which you don't want. So regardless of what type of line that you're using, if you're using a steel braided line, if you're cutting the line and you're putting fittings on, the end result has to be, it's a 10 millimeter by 1 thread pitch flare. That's the fitting that goes in here from the brake line that goes into the ABS block. So you will need that fitting in the end. If you're using like some other thread fitting, then you would need to get an adapter to go from that thread pitch that you're using to the 10 millimeter by 1. The tools that I'm using, so I have this tube bending thing. The lines that I got from Napa, they actually said that you could bend them by hand, and you can bend them by hand. It'll probably look okay, but I want to bend it with this tool as many places as I can. So this is what I use to cut it. It's just a little close quarters cutting tool. You put it around the tube, tighten it down like that, and then you just spin it around, and then close it some more and spin it some more, circle it around, tighten it some more, circle it around, and then eventually you end up cutting all the way through. And then for getting the lines off, so I had a line wrench that was a 10 millimeter on one side, 12 millimeter on the other side. I can't find it for the life of me. I haven't seen it in more than a year. So I have these Craftsman wrenches. So don't use a cheap 10 millimeter wrench. If you use a cheap 10 millimeter wrench, there's a good chance that this end is going to try to flare out, and then you could end up rounding off your brake fittings. You don't want to do that. So get something that's good. Just go to the store right now and get like a Craftsman wrench. Don't get something that's like Performance Tool or one of the, I don't know, like All Pro or something. I don't even think that's a tool brand, but don't get something that's cheap. Get something that is forged really well and try to get a line wrench. The 10 millimeter line wrench is going to be beefy, so it's twice the thickness of the 10 millimeter regular wrench, and it wraps around a little bit so that you can slide it on the line and then slide it down onto the fitting. I've talked about everything well enough that you should be able to follow that. And if you have any questions, you can leave them down below, but I'm going to pick up after and I'm going to show everything and probably talk about complications that I had with running the lines as they are. So I'm going to get to work removing all the brake lines and then start the video back whenever I have the new brake lines in place, or unless I'm going to talk about something that's a little bit of a complication. Oh, and one more thing that I forgot to mention. I stopped the camera, but I just started it back. This little wire harness section that goes to here. So there's another video that I watched on YouTube. The guy basically cut open this section of the harness and he was able to pull all the wires out until about here. So you have a lot of extra wires, but so the wires are easy to pull out. You don't have to solder and cut and extend all of them. All you really have to do is just carefully slice this open. I would suggest just like slicing it open somewhere near the seam, and then you'll have to cut around here where these wires go from here into that. You could probably snake them around the back of the firewall and then make them go over to the connector just by wrapping around the back. All right, a little update halfway through the process just to show what I have right now. These break. This just crumbled as I was trying to get it off, and I was even being careful with it because I know that the Toyota connectors are prone to break after this is 190,000 miles that are on all of these plastic connectors, so they're just breaking. This was the bracket that was holding the lines that was like right down here, bolted into the side of the strut tower, crumbled. So it's not like I'm going to use it anymore anyway, but just know that you don't have to be careful with these. Just break them, it doesn't matter. These were on the back of the firewall, broken. That one that's still on the firewall, where I'm trying to point in the right spot on the camera, right there. So that one's broken too. It's just still bolted in because I haven't taken it off yet. I probably need to because of how I'm about to run the lines. This one goes to the passenger side, so that's down here. I've already bent it up and it's nice and neat. It's in a 245-degree bends, and then it comes out kind of at an angle. It shoots over this way at an angle, comes up. So this is a 30-inch one, and for a hard line, it's kind of too short, but it's doable. Like I just had to do a lot of 45-degree bends instead of 90-degree bends. If I would have done 90s, then this would not have fit. So this is 30 inches with 45-degree bends to go up here. And I'm actually going around the battery tray too, because I decided to keep that. The battery tray I'm using to act as like a brake fluid catch so that I don't get any brake fluid on the paint. These brackets I ended up cutting off from the bracket that was mounted down here that the ABS block sat inside. So I cut the bracket off. That there's one that shoots this way, I think, or maybe I think it shoots this way actually. There's a bracket that comes this way, and then there's a bracket on the bottom, which this is the one on the bottom. It has all these little spot weld. They look like little hole punch indentions in the metal, and I basically just like ground off those little areas and then took a little mini sledgehammer and a flathead screwdriver and just hammered down and then pried out, so that I pried this off of the bottom of the bracket. The bracket itself is fine. It's not disfigured like this one is. So it handled the hammering and everything. And this is what weakened, and because I did the grinding on this to grind through the little spot welds that were on the bracket so that I could pry it off. And then I basically just drilled 2 holes in it and then drilled 2 holes in the battery tray and mounted it to the battery tray. So it's fully mounted to the battery tray now, and the battery tray acts as like a little catchment for brake fluid, and I had to clean out the little hose that goes from there to there because I realized it wasn't draining brake fluid. It was just kind of building up in the battery tray. So I just poked a little coat hanger through, and then I saw the brake fluid spit out the bottom of that. But I might have shot myself in the foot with doing that, because now I can't get the battery tray out if I have to get to the wire harness that's underneath, because the brake lines will be holding in the ABS block, and the ABS block is bolted into the battery tray. So I would have to completely disconnect the ABS block just to get the battery tray out. Another reason why I think that's an issue is I might have to take the battery tray out later on anyway, because when I was looking at this, it looks like Toyota designed this to where the brake fluid is higher than the brake fluid feed into the ABS block. So it would gravity feed into the ABS block. So when I put this in place, I realized that now this is on the same level as the reservoir, which means I'm going to have a little bit of trouble getting fluid over from the reservoir to the ABS block. So I might have to take the battery tray out and then lower everything at least a couple inches. That's all I have to work with. I can't really lower it more than a couple inches, but people have made this work because I'm doing a reverse bleeding technique. So I'm pushing the fluid up from each one of the wheels into the ABS block. So I think whenever I feed fluid into the ABS block, I'm probably going to lower the passenger side of the car a couple inches more than the driver's side of the car, just so that I can get a good gravity feed and get fluid going to this without any air bubbles. So anyway, back to talking about lines. So this line I've already talked about, 30 inches, but it's kind of a little short. It still works though if you're going around the battery tray. If you're not using the battery tray, you'd have a little bit more room to work with. This one goes to the driver's side of the master cylinder. So this one goes, kicked something. This one goes here. And you can see I have it bent up. This is the 51-inch line that goes up. And then I take about a 135-degree bend and it goes up. Kind of does a slight bend, the best that I could do with my hand. These lines can be bent by hand, so the best that I could do by hand, going over the brake booster and then going over and over and over, and then I have a couple 90-degree bends because it's a little bit longer than what it should be, but I didn't have any options to buy between 40 inches and 51 inches. Another thing with line lengths. So this is a 60-inch. I haven't tried bending this one yet, but I've put it in place and it looks like it's going to work going to the driver's side wheel. So this one I'm not worried about, the 60-inch. The ones that I'm worried about was the 40-inch lines. The guy that I'm following the guide for on, one of the forums, one of the IS300 forums, I'll have that link in the description. He mentions using 40-inch. He's using steel braided and I'm using the hard lines. But The steel braided lines, it's a lot easier to move them and to guide them and everything than it is the hard lines. He's using 40 inches to go to the junction block that's at the base of the firewall. It goes down about right there, 17 inches, well 16 inches is what I measured, but 17 inches is what I'm accounting for with bending the lines, because I'm factoring in the bends and everything from the top to the bottom of the firewall, because these were the original lines that went to the rear. This isn't bent up because I was taking it out. This is I tried to keep this intact the best I could, so these bends are factory bends on both of these lines that go down. And if I laid them out beside each other, you'd see that they match really well with the bends. So they follow the firewall and the dips and everything in the firewall so that they're hugging the firewall, going all the way down to the junction block that is, well, it's actually two junction, well, it's not a junction block, it's just two connectors, two junction connectors. But they're pretty much like right there if you follow my finger back. So they're like 16 inches down from this point down there, almost right above the starter. If you crawl into the car, you find the starter and you look above the starter, there are two brake lines that are right beside each other and they go into a little junction connector. So what I'm going to do with bending those, I've already measured out the 17 inches from this line goes all the way to here. So I set that in place and measured 17 inches to the end so that I can look and see how the line lays out over here and how much length I have, which is exactly why I went back and bought extensions here. They didn't have 51-inch lines. This measures 52 inches from end to end. And if I had 51 inches, it would just go to about right here. So that's pretty good. And I have a lot of room over on this side to bend the line and work with it. And since I have less room over here, what I'm going to do is pretty much lay these two 40-inch, well, the 40-inch sections, but they're 52 inches now. But the two 52-inch lines, I'm going to lay them beside this and then try to mimic these bends the best that I can, as close as I can to Toyota's factory bending that they had, so that when I stick them down here, they go down, I bend them to where they need to be, whatever fine adjustments I have to make with bending, and then screw them in, and then I could bend them the rest of the way up here. It's a little bit difficult doing it with an engine in the way. It would be a lot easier if this engine was not in the way, and also it would be even easier if the hood wasn't there, just because in some situations you need the line to go straight up and you kind of have to work around the hood. So if the hood and the engine aren't there, then it's like, this would be so easy. But I'm doing it like this. As it is now, the lines, there's enough to go all the way to the end. Also, if you're wondering what to do with the little vacuum switching valve that sits down here around your factory airbox, there's one hose that goes into your factory airbox, and then there's another hose that goes back to your evap canister, the charcoal canister, that's for the gas tank and everything. It's for venting out the fumes of the gas tank. That I moved whenever I did this wire harness ECU relocation. I actually moved the vacuum switching valve from here to over here. So you could see like this line is bendable by hand. And this line back here, it goes into a rubber hose that's on the firewall. So it's pretty easy after you cut it to where you want, which I used a little line cutting tool that scores around the edge over and over and over and over again. You just spin it around the line until it breaks it off. So I used that to cut this, just like I used that over here to cut this, so that this rubber line, I still use this rubber line that came from over here. Last thing that I want to mention, getting these lines off, you can see like I had to use vice grips to clamp onto this to get it off, because those were the hardest lines to remove. Actually these and the ones at the wheel were the hardest ones to remove. I had to use vice grips on the ones on the wheel too, but I'm not reusing those lines, so it doesn't matter. But I had to use vice grips on these lines to get them off, because when I was using my Craftsman's wrench, because like I said, I lost this, which I had to go and buy another one, which this brand is completely horrible. This Craftsman wrench was doing a better job at not spreading apart whenever I had it on the connector and I was putting a lot of force behind it trying to loosen it up. This Craftsman wrench was doing a better job at the ends not spreading out so that it would end up rounding off the head of the line connector. So I just sucked it up and went and spent 20 bucks on a well, it's cheaply made, but it's overpriced, which is extremely frustrating. This brand is absolutely horrible as a line wrench. The end spreads out, and it was rounding out my the flare fitting easier than this one was. And this one is a thinner profile than this. This is fatter. So like Craftsman is infinitely superior to this crap. Like I almost want to throw it away. Even though Napa has a no return policy on their tools, I am going to try to return this and just say that this thing sucks. This is horrible. So Carlisle or Napa, if you're watching this, this is just a horrible tool. It really is. It messed up my line worse than this 10mm Craftsman did. Even this is Craftsman. Craftsman makes good quality stuff, but this was doing a better job at not spreading out and holding more torque than this thing was. But those are all the updates. What I'm going to do next, since I'm flushing out my lines to get all of the junk away from the calipers, I'm going to, this is one of the hard lines that I'm using. I'm just going to screw this in there so that I could put my syringe on the end and then feed clean fluid in to push clean fluid down the line and out of the caliper. And I'm just gonna set up my tripod and actually record that, because you get to see how dirty the fluid is that's coming out from around the caliper. And that is not something that you want to go into your ABS block, because if you have dirty fluid going into your ABS block and all the contaminants and everything that's around your caliper, there's a good chance that's going to gunk up the ABS block. And if it doesn't kill it immediately, it'll definitely shorten the lifespan of it. So that's pretty much where I am now. I'm going to get back to work flushing out the lines going out from the line out of the caliper instead of from the caliper up and out of the line, just because I want to push the contaminants down and out with clean fluid. I am using clean fluid to do this. Okay, this is the end result, and I'm honestly pretty pleased with it. The wires, the seam on these wires was actually kind of like pretty much in this location. I hope it's in the same location on your car whenever you go to cut this. I had to pull the harness underneath here, so this had to be unsnapped. I kind of just cut the tape off of this, and I removed the little clip that was going into this. And then I had this wire dressing from one of the older harnesses that I pulled apart from another vehicle when I extended the wire harness in the engine bay to where the ECU is in the interior. So I had to cut open another harness to do that, and I had all the plastic pieces from that. So this I have wrapped around here, and I have this plugged back in, even though my plastic connector broke horribly on this. And again, I'm probably going to replace this in the future with the Chase Bays kit, because the more I looked at the picture, the more I realized that it looks like the Chase Bays kit has the proportioning valve that you can separate from the master cylinder that would replace the brake booster over there with its own reservoir. So the brake booster and the reservoir would disappear, and then the Chase Bays master cylinder with its own little reservoir would sit over there, make room for my new intake manifold that's huge, and the proportioning valve I can relocate to over here and put all my lines in it, so it wouldn't be that much of a reroute with all the lines that are here. These are my extensions, and I've got to monitor these for leaks because I have 2 more breaks in the line where they go into that coupler. I don't like that, and it's the same thing for the other one. Those are the lines that go down. I should have used 51-inch lines, but Napa didn't have those when I went back to get the lines, so I just ended up buying the 2 little 1-foot sections and 2 couplers. The cost of all of the lines together that I used in doing this it was 70 bucks. And I went through 1 quart of .3 brake fluid and 1 12-ounce bottle of .3 brake fluid. The 12-ounce bottle is the one that I used to flush out the entire system and flush out the calipers and clean out the lines. I used most of the 1 quart bottle filling up the rest of the system. So following the lines, I'm going to dress these up whenever I pull the engine out. I mean, it's pretty hard to work over there. I had to unbolt the brackets from the firewall and then work with that. This, I wasn't too happy with how this came out. It looks a little ugly, it's hard to bend up, but this line was a little bit longer than what I wanted it to be. This is the 51-inch line. I probably could have used a 48 one. It would have been a little bit better, and I could have just like come over this way, curved, and went straight down. So if this was a few inches shorter, that would be ideal. All the other lines are pretty close to the lengths that I used. 51-inch lines going down were a good length. This is just the only one that was really too long, and then the 30-inch line that goes from here down to the passenger side front, that was a little bit shorter, but I went around the battery tray, which is now the brake fluid catchment that leads brake fluid down to the bottom of the car. The bleeding technique that I used is a reverse bleeding technique. So basically what I did is I took my syringe, which it was on the other end of this, but I washed out the rubber side, the plunger side, because this isn't made for brake fluid, so I had to rinse that out. But what I basically did is I started at the longest line first. So the line that's farthest from the ABS is the passenger rear. So I pushed the fluid with the syringe from that all the way up here with, I think this is the passenger rear. So I had this one loosened, pushed the fluid up until it started bubbling out, and you can hear it whenever you're pushing fluid up with the syringe. You can hear it bubble as long as you have a quiet environment. So you can hear it bubbling up until the bubbles stop. And then I left the syringe connected, closed the bleed screw, came over here, and then closed this screw. And then I did the same thing to the driver's side rear, then the driver's side front, and then this passenger side front. And then after that, I pushed the fluid through from this line into the reservoir. So I disconnected this line, put my hose on it, and pushed fluid up from there into the reservoir. And then I did the same thing with this line down here, connected my syringe to it, pushed the fluid through to that side, and then I opened this bleed screw on the ABS, pushed fluid through here, and then this took probably the full 250 milliliters of the syringe, because I'm pushing fluid into here. It's going from here into this line, and you can hear it bubbling, and until all the bubbles stop, you can hear that going over to the reservoir. And then I filled up the reservoir from this bleed screw. I didn't pour fluid. I didn't pour any fluid in the top. Right now it's at the max line because I pumped all the fluid in through this. Then after all the fluid was put back into the lines, I went back around with my syringe in the reverse bleeding, and I pushed it up starting from that side. So rear passenger side, went back to the rear driver side, went over to the front driver side, and then went to the front passenger side. And each side I pushed fluid up with the syringe, and I had this bleed screw open when I did that with an extra hose that curled up, pretty much sitting on that line, so that this would have a little bit of a back pressure while the fluid is being pushed out. It wouldn't suck any air back in. It would just hang out in that hose that was directed more in the upward position. And it feels pretty solid. It does feel like there's a little bit of air trapped in the lines somewhere, and I think that is because the ABS is supposed to sit lower than the reservoir. So it's supposed to sit down here. Right now it sits probably about 2 inches lower. If you can look and see, like, that reservoir is about ½ an inch below this, the top of the firewall, and this is probably about 3 inches, 2 to 3 inches below the top of the firewall. So that difference in height, this is 2 inches below where it should be about a foot below the reservoir. So it's not able to fully gravity bleed. That's why I want to lower this side of the car and then go around and reverse bleed again. This is one of the things that I broke while I was working with the lines, so I've got to work on that. The car still starts and everything, but there's a huge vacuum leak. And this goes on to the vacuum switching valve that's for the, the TVIS or the AVIS or whatever Toyota's calling it now, the flapper that sits in here that's actuated by that vacuum diaphragm down there. And then the vacuum switching valve controls it. So I broke that, and I've got to find a T-fitting and then get back to that vacuum switching valve and connect all that stuff back together. Because that T-valve goes to my boost gauge. And then my vacuum switching valve, I just kind of touched on that a little bit earlier, but this was relocated from where it used to sit over here. So it's also going to be out of the way of the turbo. It's over here. I had to extend the wires, but the wires, when I cut open the harness to extend the factory ECU into the engine, out of the engine bay into the interior, I moved the vacuum switching valve from over there to over here. This line is pretty easy to reroute. I'm going to dress this up again whenever I have the engine out, so it'll be a little bit easier to touch this up and make this look nicer, but that way the vacuum switching valve will still be over here. It'll still be venting out from the gas tank like it's supposed to, because this goes to the evap canister. I've already showed the power cable that's running underneath. It comes up into the interior here, and then coming back here into the trunk, where the battery's located. I have it right now in this strap until I can get a battery box. Again, my friend is printing a box to put the battery in, and then I want to secure it, and I want to have it as close to the corner as possible so that I can make use of this little empty space that's underneath the carpet and guide a hose down just in case the battery leaks into the box. The hose would guide the battery acid outside. Eventually I do want to get one of the sealed maintenance free batteries and put it back here to get rid of this the lead acid battery, just so I don't really have to worry about getting any battery acid in the trunk and eating away carpet and paint and all that other stuff. This works really well. The shutoff switch that I took the little arm out of, I drilled the rivet out, and then I put this 300 amps so that this fuse will pop if any of the wires rub on anywhere underneath the body. This I still have to figure out how to take it off. It's in a position right now where I can't hold this wire well enough to unbolt this. I think it's a 13mm nut, so that I can get this wire off. So I just have it safed off just in case it touches anything. It's not going to arc on the body and then pop my fuse that I put in. But this was a 5-pack, so if I pop this, then I can just put another one of the 5 fuses in. And I have this little piece of wood under there because I couldn't get the this terminal clamp down far enough on the battery post to where this wasn't floating on top. And this was just kind of, since this is plastic, it was kind of wobbling a little bit, and I don't know, I didn't want it to break this and then put stress on the fuse and then rip something out. I don't know what this is, but it's from the BMW. I've got to take this off. So it goes over here, and I don't know. I don't know what that goes to. But all in all, this is a pretty fun, pretty time-consuming project that I'm glad that I'm done with this. And then as it is right now, if I come in, pressing the brake, it's actually pretty firm. I can't push it hard enough without my feet sliding back. So it's pretty firm. Does need to be a little bit more firm. I just have to finish bleeding the brake system a little bit and just get that dialed in. And in the future, sell my ABS on eBay and then put a Chase Bays one in there so that I'll have an adjustable proportioning valve, no more ABS system. Once I put the Haltech in the car, it's not going to work anyway. So yeah, ABS is going to be gone. So total cost of everything. Battery relocation by itself was $15 for the 5-pack of mega fuses, because I mean there's 5 of them, but you know, so $15 for that. It was $10 for the cutoff switch. That's the little arm thing that I hacked up so that it holds the mega fuse. $70 for the BMW 325i positive cable that goes from the trunk now straight to the starter. And then 80 wires for the custom made 12-foot ground wire that's 0 gauge that goes also from the trunk all the way, that's bolted into that bracket that supports the intake manifold and then bolts into the block. The box that my friend is printing me, it's going to be free. He's just trying to use up all of his plastic that he has, all the PLA printable plastic stuff that he has. So that part was free, but if you want to buy a marine box so that your battery doesn't spill anything out in the trunk, then that's, you know, I think those are like 50 bucks for the marine boxes that contain it. And then all of the ABS lines, all total, I think it was $75 for all of the brake lines with the 2 bottles of brake fluid, so the 1 quart and then the 12-ounce bottle of .3 that I used. Again, the 12-ounce bottle was used to flush out the system, and then I used most of the 1 quart bottle to refill the system and reservoir and all of that stuff. So all total, you're looking at about $270, $280 for the battery relocation and the ABS relocation, using stuff that you can get at Napa and other things that you can get on eBay that would be delivered with a few days. So it's really not that expensive when you look at it compared to what the price of the ABS kits ABS delete or ABS relocation or battery relocation kits would be. So it's not bad. So I saved money on this too. But that's all. Thanks a lot for watching. Make sure you like, subscribe, comment, and as always, God bless you guys.